Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and students. I am delighted to see that so many of you have found your way to Humboldt University's Senate Hall for the start of the Mosse Lecture. My name is Ethel Matala, and I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you. This summer term's lecture series is dedicated to the topic of Zionism. We chose this topic because we have seen the term weaponized in the context of the current situation in the Middle East, and therefore we feel the need to clarify and provide insight into the history of Zionism, moving beyond the narrow definition of the term as the project of founding a Jewish nation-state. By inviting contributions from scholars of philosophy, Jewish studies, and historiography, and by including Palestine perspectives, we hope to present a variety of historical aspects of Zionism before 1948 and demonstrate that the concept of Zionism is not monolithic. In the subtitle of the lecture series, we deliberately chose the plural forms, stories, and projects to highlight the diversity of interests and concerns that accompanied the emergence of Zionist movements in Eastern and Western Europe from the 19th century onward. One of those early projects was the plan to establish a university, a plan which was realized after World War I. The Hebrew University, and this is the institution I'm talking about, opened exactly 100 years ago on April 1st of 1925 with a grand ceremony. In response to quotas imposed by European universities that limited Jewish students' access, the young chemist Chaim Weizmann developed the initial ideas for the university with Martin Buber and Berthold Feivel. Initially, they also considered Europe as a possible location for the prospective Jewish university. Palestine was not the only site on their map. Another point for discussion was later, after the decision in favor of Jerusalem, the nature of the institution. Should it be an elite research institution similar to the Institut Pasteur in Paris? Or should it be a full university? If the latter, who should study there? The question was whether it should primarily invite local students or become a center of attraction for top Jewish academics worldwide. Given that most of the professors and lecturers had moved there from Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, the answer was not obvious. Since the Palestinian government did not provide financial support for the university, it relied on donations from Jewish supporters worldwide. And further conflicts with urban society arose because many prominent members of the university, including founding rector Judah Magnes, philosophers Hugo Bergmann and Martin Buber, and historian Gershom Scholem, were members of the Brit Shalom organization. Brit Shalom conceived of itself as a peace league, actually this is the literal translation, and advocated for a binational state. Beyond Mount Scopus, however, where the university is located, this position was less popular. For the settlers who had come to Palestine in previous decades, most of whom were from Eastern Europe, other issues took precedence. In 1881, severe pogroms against the Jewish population began in the Russian Empire and recurred multiple times in the following years. There were nearly 260 riots, resulting in hundreds of deaths and thousands of injuries. During this period, Zionist movements in Russia began organizing the establishment of small Jewish settlements in Palestine. Their main aim was to provide immigrants with a safe haven. Meanwhile, in France, the Dreyfus affair, in which a Jewish officer, Alfred Dreyfus, was wrongfully convicted of treason, fueled anti-Semitic sentiment in Western Europe. In the shadow of this defamation, the Viennese journalist and writer Theodor Herzl revisited the idea of a Jewish state which others had raised before him. His plea for a new beginning in an Altneuland was inspired by the sober realization that enlightenment and legal emancipation had done little to change anti-Jewish attitudes, and that the proven willingness of Jews to integrate and acculturate did not protect them from non-Jewish hatred and violence. What united the various Zionist movements, despite all their differences, was the conviction of the need for self-emancipation. The first writer to call for such self- or auto-emancipation was the Russian Jewish intellectual Leon Pinsker. As anti-Jewish riots continued in the Tsarist Empire, he departed from the ideas of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, and argued that Jews were not and would never be welcome in European culture. He described the Jewish predicament as a paradox, stating that Jews were neither indigenous to their homeland nor foreign, but rather outsiders. Outsiders kat exochen. They were seen as neither friend or enemy, but as strangers who did not belong, or, in his words, unknowns of whom it is only known that they have no homeland. Unquote. His diagnosis was widely shared by Jews across Western and Eastern Europe, but nevertheless, the question of what a new Heimstätte, a homeland that would enable self-emancipation, could look like, sparked new controversies that continue to this day. Was the search for a permanent, a secure home primarily a political endeavor, and could the answer be found in establishing a Jewish nation state modeled on European ones, or was it more about reviving Jewish culture and traditions to provide Jews with a spiritual homeland through cultural Zionism? Would the homeland involve a muscular Judaism as conceived by Max Nordau, involving the development of new self-confidence through a new awareness of the body, as well as physical regeneration through strength, health, power, and health? To what extent did self-emancipation depend on immigration to Palestine? As early as the 19th century, a vast majority of Jews who no longer saw a future for themselves in Europe chose to move west to North America rather than east, attracted by the prospect of freedom. Life in the diaspora was part of a long-standing Jewish tradition. Hannah Arendt identified the conflict between establishing a state and the tradition of being a people in exile as an inherent Zionist dilemma. In addition to Palestine, one of the main hotspots of this tension since the early 20th century has been the diaspora in the United States. Many American Jews were skeptical about the idea of founding a state, let alone immigrate to it. And for them, terms such as exile or galut have positive connotations. Among those who found a new home in the United States after emigrating from Europe was George Mosse, the namesake of our lecture series. Since the late 1960s, however, he also taught at the Hebrew University every other semester. As in its early years, the university was both a Jewish institution and an international heterotopia within Jerusalem, and perhaps this is at least one of the reasons that prompted Mosse to connect with Israel. Tonight's opening talk for our lecture series will focus on George Mosse, or I have to say at least depart from George Mosse, discussing the contradictions of Jewishness, Zionism, and Israel through the lens of his unique and certainly exceptional biography. Over the next 2 months, we will welcome more international guests from Israel, England, and North America, who will share insights from their recent research. Next week, Mark David Baer, a professor of history at the London School of Economics and Political Science, will discuss the history of Muslim-Jewish relations, a subject he has studied for decades. In his lecture, Mark David Baer will focus on the early 20th century and Palestine during the British Mandate. He is currently working on a monograph entitled Children of Abraham, which is scheduled for release next spring. Please note that this lecture will take place on Friday instead of Thursday, next Friday. On June 19th, our guest will be Bashir Bashir, a political theory professor at the Open University of Israel in Ra'anana. He is currently a fellow at the Berlin Institute for Advanced Study, the Wissenschaftskolleg, and he will dedicate his lecture on the Holocaust and the Nakba to discuss the possibility of an egalitarian binational ethics. The fourth and final Mosse lecture of the semester will be presented on July 10th by Rabbi Shaul Magid. Rabbi Magid is a visiting professor of modern Jewish studies at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the topic of his talk will be the obsession with defining anti-Semitism. He will explore why Jews find it so difficult to talk about anti-Semitism today. Now turning to tonight's opening lecture, I am delighted and also excited to welcome Stephen Aschheim, who has joined us from Israel. Stephen Aschheim grew up in South Africa. The Hebrew University also plays an important role in his biography because he met George Mosse there for the first time. Mosse later supervised Steve Aschheim's dissertation titled The East European Jew in German and German Jewish Consciousness. Since 1998, Stephen Aschheim has taught as a full professor of history at the University of Jerusalem. He has held visiting professorships at several prestigious places, including the University of Wisconsin at Madison, the New York University, the University of Budapest, and the University of Toronto, among many others. Since 2007, he has been the director of the Franz Rosenzweig Minerva Research Center for German Jewish Literature and Cultural History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the name of this research center reflects and covers perfectly his primary areas of research. From his extensive body of work, I would like to highlight Culture and Catastrophe, German and Jewish Confrontations with National Socialism and Other Crises, which was released in English in 1996 and published in a German translation last year, as well as the essay collection In Times of Crisis, Essays on European Culture, Germans and Jews from 2001. Another volume I'm happy to mention is Beyond the Border, The German Jewish Legacy Abroad, released in 2007. His most recent publication is Fragile Spaces, Forays into Jewish Memory, European History, and Complex Identities, which came out in 2020. The title of his lecture today is Reflections on Liberal and Humanist Nationalism in Times of War, George Mosse and the Contradictions of Jewishness, Zionism, and Israel. As always, there will be time for questions after the lecture. Please join me now in welcoming Stephen Aschheim.
The chair was quite correct in saying a very warm welcome, because it is very warm here. So I've taken my jacket off in anticipation of what I hope will be a lively and controversial discussion. The title is, as we heard, is Reflections on Liberal and Humanist Nationalism in Times of War, and the subtitle is on George Mosse and the Contradictions of Jewishness, Zionism, and Israel. But I will begin with George Mosse and then get to the much heavier and more difficult problem of liberal and humanist nationalism in times of war, which is not an easy topic at all. So I am delighted that you have invited me to this occasion, and this is actually the second Humboldt lecture I have delivered, because nearly 20 years ago, the talk was entitled The Historian and Autobiography, George Mosse's Life in History. In that talk, I did not examine George's views on nationalism in general, nor those of Zionism. But now we are in a far more turbulent, unstable war era, and many of his insights on these matters, as well perhaps of some of his blind spots, take on a particular relevance, which is the Gaza War. That will be the main question that I will be discussing. So let us begin with Mosse's conceptions of nationalism and Zionism. For George, as I always called him, the connections between Jewishness, Zionism, and Israel were complicated, surprising, and in many ways conflicted and self-contradicting. Let us remember, after all, that George was a member of the extremely wealthy, highly acculturated German Jewish elite, son of the owners of the famed and later defamed liberal newspaper, the Berliner Tageblatt. That paper was hardly identified with any Jewish nationalist or Zionist sympathies. Indeed, as George's friend, his much admired friend Gershom Scholem regarded, he said, "I found it somewhat of a triumph that the son of a leading anti-Zionist family has ended up in Jerusalem." Theodore, and this now I'm quoting from George's autobiography, Theodor Herzl had already said unkind words about Rudolf Mosse, my grandfather, and indeed, my family remained opposed to Zionism even as I started to teach in Jerusalem. I'm not talking about me, I'm talking about George. Certainly, both in his earlier life and work, even though his Jewish identity was never in question, George's footprints were far more Christian than Jewish. Part of his early exilic education was at Botham, which was a Quaker school, and when he was at Harvard, he regularly attended Episcopal services. And his first historical writings were on Christian theology, on Calvinism and Puritanism. Indeed, his 1933 work on the Reformation is still read and used today. And even in his later rediscovery of things Jewish and Zionist, his background clearly influenced the particular way in which he approached them. Always he sought to kind of de-ghettoize both Jewish history and Zionism and integrate it within larger structures and sensibilities. As was his wont, he often did this in very mischievous, almost subversive ways. For instance, his early essay on the relationship between Jewish identity, Zionism, and German folkish ideology. But most centrally and positively, he portrayed the making of modern German Jewish identity, and also his own, as being recreated on the basis of materials taken from German culture, especially the late Enlightenment ideal of Bildung. For Mosse, Jewish emancipation did not lead to a loss of Jewish identity, but rather to its radical redefinition. He regarded Gershom Scholem's highly negative reading of Jewish identity as impoverished. He regarded the German Jewish heritage very positively, insisting upon its integral relation to a particular strand of Bildung, its open, progressive, humanist, and moral guise. Here, he argued, was a sensibility characterized by a belief in the primacy of culture, the personalizing of relationships. That was crucial, the personalizing of relationships, and the assumption that taming the irrational would in some rational way activate the moral imperative. He was realistic enough, however, to see that with the rise of Nazism, this belief in the primacy of culture led to a kind of naive politics of delusion. Actually, this recognition of the limits of positions with which he positively identified is a rather unremarked aspect of Mosse's work. This honesty extended into his private life, where he would often admit contradictions, indeed fundamental incompatibilities, between his historical and intellectual analyses on the one hand, and his personal attractions and loyalties on the other. And it is actually the admission of these contradictions which gives his work its energy and its creative originality. So the complexity is clearly apparent, as we'll now see, in his relationship to Zionism and Israel. And let me put it more generally first, before we touch on Zionism. As a self-described man of the Enlightenment, and there was no question about his relationship, his attraction to the Enlightenment, was about critical unmasking and demystifying the structures and dynamics of myths and symbols, fascist and nationalist ideologies, racism, anti-Semitism, bourgeois respectability, attitudes to the outsider, and most centrally, the dialectics of inclusion and exclusion, the dangers and pressures of intolerance, conformity, and homogeneity. All this linked to the creation of internal and external enemies. Now, in my opinion, vital history is never removed from personal biography. Mosse's insights were in many ways rendered possible by his own life and the painfully constricting experiences, both as a Jew and a gay man. Though he insisted that he did not belong to a generation where victimization is a badge of pride, he also at a late stage literally wore the yellow star with pride. There's a rather startling photograph. I never use PowerPoint. I've never done it, but it would be the right time to show you this picture, where George, at the family Berlin grave, is wearing a skull cap with a remarkable and unusually large yellow star prominently displayed on the front. Now, what on earth has all this to do with Zionism in Israel? With George's understanding of, and perhaps contrarily, his personal relationship to these. His statement in 1986 already reveals the complexity, indeed the incompatibility, between his intellectual interest and his personal attraction. I quote, "I came to my present Zionist position through study and research on anti-Semitism, racism, and fascism, in thought through the activities of a historian, perhaps a sounder way to arrive at this goal than pure emotional commitment. Though," and he immediately added, "I will readily admit that to one who has seen so much Jewish humiliation, the romanticism of Zionism has an obvious appeal." Belonging to a generation, if I can get this piece of paper out, belonging to a generation that had lived through the Shoah, he went so far as to define his Zionism as social redemption, as personal redemption. He was acutely aware of the magnitude of the remarkable achievements of early Zionism and later the State of Israel. And here I must add, this is an awareness that is being radically challenged as we talk. The loss of memory of its initial, almost unbelievable achievement is being rapidly erased. Yet this was, and it is, a necessary perspective that I think is being lost at the moment. Superficially, I suppose one could say that because for Mosse, victimization was not a positive value, he was attracted to Zionism and a strong state of Israel precisely because it seemed to represent the overcoming of that victim status. Now, that's already problematic, because October the 7th was clearly a point at which Zionism did not seem to be the master of its destiny, but a victim. A drive, he insisted, to what he called Jewish normalization, the move from being a despised minority to a normative majority. But after all, there's little in praise of normative majorities. On the contrary, much of Mosse's work revolves around the pressures and pernicious effects of being a majority. Critically, he noted, this, I'm quoting, "This new Zionist Jew represented a normalization, an assimilation to general middle-class ideals and stereotypes, bourgeois notions which he regarded negatively as constricting. In his view, their related categories of energy, beauty, work, muscularity necessarily excluded those who were not like them. Indeed, he was one of the first to draw attention, as you correctly said, to Max Nordau's call for Muskeljudentum. So please do not look at me as an exemplar of that. How then can one reconcile, or at least understand, these intellectual and existential tensions and contradictions? In intellectual terms, Mosse was able to justify, or at least salvage, his version of Zionism and the state through an analytic distinction which he claimed belonged to the early history of nationalism in general. He insisted upon a principled distinction between what he called patriotic as opposed to integral nationalism. I suppose today these would be the difference between what is called ethnic and civic nationalism. Thus, he argued, in 18th century Germany, the idea of friendship, which symbolized the autonomy of personal relations and the acceptance of individual differences, the free exercise of citizenship, coexisted with a sense of patriotism and national identification. Solidarity rather than domination prevailed. And thus he argued it was only in the 19th century that integral nationalism arose, with its controlling claims of totality that challenged personal relationships and gave rise to a homogenized inconformity of those who belonged and those who did not. This is where it becomes interesting. He sought to apply the same historical and moral logic that he thought characterized early German nationalism and projected it onto Zionism. Precisely because Jews had been forced into the position of outsiders and as the chief victims of European nationalism, he wrote, so many Zionists look back at a time when nationalism and individuality had coexisted in some harmony. At that time in history, between two world wars, these Jews saw themselves as the enemies of an integral nationalism and became advocates of an alternative nationalism which might keep its earlier promise. Now, what evidence is there for Mosse to bring to bear? It was basically the idea of Bildung, and he said, those people who you mentioned, the binationalists, who were essentially people from Central Europe, exactly incarnated these values. Among these figures were Hugo Bergmann, Robert Welch, Kurt Blumenfeld, Martin Buber, Gershom Scholem. These were people, Mosse argued, who insisted upon the originally humanist face of an essentially tolerant liberal experiment that could have avoided being an integral nationalism and a conformist nationalism. Now, one may wonder how far we can go with this analysis. For the moment, however, we have to note that rather uniquely, George not only possessed a deep understanding of the power structures that he was critiquing, he not only critiqued power, but he was also deeply attracted to them. That's what makes him interesting. to critique and yet be attracted. For instance, he actively encouraged his students and readers to understand the powerful attractions of nationalism in general and fascism in particular. His school at Salem, he wrote, gave me a first taste of nationalism, which at the time I found very attractive. There was a real danger that I might fall into this belief system because I didn't have any other. When, as a historian, much later I wrote about nationalism, I did have an insight into nationalism's truly seductive nature. Indeed, at the age of about 15, he watched a Nazi demonstration in front of his home in Berlin. He wrote, I quote, "The impression was so great that I ran away from home, it must have been in 1932, and went to a Hitler rally. I must admit even today that it was an experience. I was swept away. First there were the masses of people. That was very captivating to be in the middle of it all. But it was also Hitler. Though the way you can see the results of these thoughts in a book I don't know if it's been translated into German, on the nationalization of the masses. Nationalism, he later declared, will not vanish. It fulfills legitimate hopes and ideals for community." The same empathic duality, the same contradiction applied to Zionism and Israel for Mosse. He identified with the very nationalist myths and symbols that he had tried to demystify. As he himself wrote, I was far from consistent. My own engagement in Israel told of the need for a concrete embodiment of my identity. My accelerated heartbeat when I witnessed the swearing in of Israeli paratroopers on Masada, which he always said, oh, Israel's holy mountain. That's how he used to talk. Reveals the attraction of an emotional commitment, even for one who prides himself on the use of reason. Perhaps such a reaction is based upon the experience and the study of anti-Semitism and its constant denial of Jewish manhood. However, once again, ideal and reality differ, even within my own person. I remember vividly my joy on my first visit when I saw sturdy, self-confident Jews. Just have another picture of the Israeli Jew. Don't look at me for that. It was this, again, a stereotype. But I was far from immune to the irrational forces which, as a historian, I deplored, and that especially when it came to the group which I regard as my own. With all his commitments to the reason of a humanist enlightenment, Mosse was candid enough to regard his identification as a Jew and a Zionist, and perhaps by extension as a gay man, simply on the basis of solidarity and what he called a sense of belonging. In addressing a Hebrew university, he referred to Israel as our state. No doubt that feeling of belonging was related to the Nazi destruction of European Jewry. Nothing, he wrote, in European history is a stranger to the Holocaust. Maybe this affirmation was part of an unstated realism and appreciation of the need for organized force and collective self-defense in a very imperfect, murderous world. There was, he reflected, always a certain pull towards realism, to the feeling that if one did not belong to a strong nation, one could slide back into the statelessness that I had experienced. But the commitment was even more primordial than that. Ultimately, this great unmasker, the champion of reason, would put his historically conditioned special bond with his fellow Jews, quite simply, he wrote, in terms of love. Indeed, while initially agreeing with Hannah Arendt's statement that one could only love individuals, not whole peoples, Mosse admitted that he had been disingenuous, for I did feel a sense of belonging, close to love, even as I taught the lasting importance of rationality and enlightenment. Aware that Zionism embodied the normalizing bourgeois ideals and stereotypes of power, which, he wrote, I profess to dislike, But I could not help myself. Faced with this Zionist ideal, my reason and historical knowledge were overcome. Nevertheless, despite all these contradictions, he did ultimately seek to maintain the values of enlightenment, liberalism, and Bildung in the face of nationalism, which he recognized was here to stay. The crucial question for him, and I think for us today, was not how to dismantle these constricting structures, but as he wrote, I quote, "Our mission should be the humanizing of nationalism and not its abolition." Now, there's something admirable in the assertion of a positive potential within these existing forms of community. Who could argue with these wonderful sentiments filled with an empathic and compassionate sensibility? But I'm not writing this in a vacuum. So let me introduce a skeptical word and then proceed to the violent present in which we are all living. Historically, I would argue, the 18th century patriotism of friendship and the free exercise of citizenship of which he spoke was really a pale form of nationalism that never ever prevailed. At certain moments, he himself recognized that the combined ideals of this patriotism, liberation from foreign rule, as well as self-determination, were incompatible. Even amongst its most progressive early prophets, he wrote, "National liberation undermines democratic self-determination." Yet he nevertheless clung to his portrait of the promise of patriotic as against chauvinist nationalism. He regarded Zionism potential very much in this idealized light. In a candid 1986 statement, he declared that "I've spent so much time investigating that nationalism which has made the Jews one of its principal victims does not mean that a nobler nationalism cannot exist. Indeed, it did exist in the past, and it was based upon solidarity rather than aggression. Today," I'm quoting him still, "it seems almost forgotten that it was precisely the majority of Zionists in Western Europe who for a long time continued into the 20th century this noble but archaic nationalism." Here comes the very problematic part. There would have been every reason for our own state to have capitulated before this exclusive and aggressive nationalism, but it has not done so. This was written in 1986. The battle is still joined. We have a great opportunity, based upon Jewish history and the history of Zionism, to uphold the ideal of a nationalism whose essence is solidarity, not exclusiveness. Now I'm going to have some water because I'm getting to the difficult part. A long time has passed since Mosse made this extraordinary statement. I am not sure he would say the same thing today. Even prior to October 23, he was aware that the challenges were very extreme. The balance between a liberal democracy and a humanist nationalism, coexisting with what is officially defined in ethno-religious terms as the Jewish state, has always been a tension and a fragile one. My task here, however, and this is the main point of the paper, is to examine the even greater challenges, pitfalls, and mechanisms that face and impede the liberal and humanist sensibility in a rough, war-torn Middle East, where the cannons are still roaring as I speak. Let me be clear. When discussing the Israel-Gaza War and the accumulated 6 other fronts, I have to be very narrowly focused and precise. I'm not going to analyze the war strategies, the techniques of battle, the geopolitics, or even the radically declined image of Israel and the related relevance of anti-Semitism, the invocation of the Holocaust and Nazism, All of these topics, I hope, we can talk about in the discussion. I know that they are more pertinent to a German audience than what I've prepared, but my aim here is to relate through the prism of my own unsettled Israeli experience some of the most central challenges and threats posed to the very possibility of Israel's self-definition as a liberal and humanist nationalism. That this is part of Israeli self-definition is very much to Israel's credit. The fact that it does conceive of itself, even in its statement of the independence as a liberal and humanist nationalism, is part of its self-definition, and I would argue that's very much to Israel's credit. Now, it is common knowledge that even prior to October 7, Israeli society was in a state of extreme polarization. Its deeper roots are in structural tensions, which are inherent in the Zionist project itself. But its immediate cause was aroused by an unprecedented extreme right-wing government with fundamentalist, messianic, and certain fascist elements in it, intent upon a judicial coup and other measures that sought to radically diminish the power of the courts and other institutions and thereby abolish previous liberal democratic checks and balances on government power. The tensions were so great that there is virtual agreement that the Hamas attack occurred when it did, precisely because of these divisions. Israel's internal weakness and vulnerability seemed apparent to everyone. Indeed, civil war seemed a very real possibility. October 7th both merged and dwarfed these previous developments. The total shock of the complacently unexpected, the cataclysm of atrocity, death, and defeat, the fear, rage, and outrage, the sense of defenselessness which Zionism and Israel had supposedly eliminated, was traumatic in the extreme. For Israelis, the cruelty of this religiously based ecstasy of violence and joy at destruction of 1,200 people and the capture of 250 civilian hostages, it's been impossible to digest. Israel at the moment is a traumatized society. This was not just a military event, but a kind of deeply unsettling existential and epistemological earthquake, where assured perspectives and stable assumptions were shattered. It is patently obvious that in times of war, liberalism will always come under heavy bombardment. But these conditions have rendered the strain on the humanist sensibility especially heavy. Now, skeptics have been very quick to point out that naive liberals often find it difficult to recognize that deadly enemies actually do exist. Robert Frost once scathingly commented, liberals can't even take their own side in an argument, implying not only a kind of self-inflicting defeatism, but the very real hatreds of one's foes must be faced head-on. Now, because I am a liberal, I'm going to give you the critique of liberalism which some Israelis have made. The first is a man called Asaf Sagiv. He fashioned a principled critique of the liberal humanist position. He writes, after the horrifying bloodbath of October 7, the liberal illusion has been shattered and should teach us the following lesson. The enemy does not think as we think. Our values are not his values. Our logic is not his logic. And what many of us consider most sacred, our lives, the lives of those dear to us, life as such, is considered by our enemy as worthless. He then went on to quote Mohammed Def, who was killed later. Expressed this explicitly in July 2014. Today this is Mohammed Def, who was a Hamas leader. Today you are fighting the soldiers of God who love death for the sake of Allah as you love life and compete among yourselves for martyrdom, as you flee from death. And Segiv concludes this way: Israel cannot be the idyllic liberal democracy it fantasizes about. The fences have been breached, and the predators are here. The villa will not stand if we allow the liberals to manage it this way. Another critic, Dan Shiftan, puts it this way: too much liberalism, especially by progressives, is the enemy of liberalism. Now, these commentators typically describe the conflict in terms of civilized people fighting savages or defending Western civilization against invading barbarians, demonizing labels which always accompany war. We know this in almost every war. The barbarians are at the gate and we are the civilized ones. Now, one of the implications of the belief that the enemy other lives in an utterly alien, unreachable, incomprehensible world, Shiftan does distinguish between the barbarians and the civilian population of Gaza, but claims that the barbarians, that's the word he uses, relied precisely on liberal predispositions not to harm civilians and thus destroy the civilized side's willingness to prevail. And he adds that in a battle for one's very existence, the hope is that we can find a way of breaking the barbarian without losing what we are, without undermining what we are. But this is the great moral dilemma. The line here is very thin. Too often, the rhetoric blurs all distinctions between Hamas militants and the entire Gaza population. One endlessly hears rhetoric that there are no innocents. Everyone in Gaza is Hamas, which mirrors the similarly often heard Hamas claim that all Jews are legitimate targets. The constant invocation of we civilized against those barbarians, I think many of you know Susan Neiman. She quoted the following statement where she said, "Evil seems to always be on the other side." This erases the fundamental belief of a humanist in a common humanity. Such dehumanization produces a kind of slippery legitimation for the killing of civilians. And it's easier to kill civilians because the fact is that Hamas consciously embeds itself within the civilian population. In the face of this, and the real dangers confronting soldiers, conscience is dulled and the upholding of self-proclaimed moral standards weakened. Now, let me be clear. The ruthless October 7th attack on non-combatants, on civilians, on men, women, and children, the killings, abductions, hostage-taking, burnings, and rapes was shocking in its depravity. The ongoing deep Israeli trauma of a newfound vulnerability, the loss of a sense of security, the walking wounded, has produced a very deep scar. But these tendencies have not been an exclusively one-sided phenomenon. Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, early declared, "We are fighting human animals." Radical right Minister Smotrich has called for the total destruction of Gaza. Some politicians suggested nuking Gaza, and Minister Avi Dichter described the war as rolling out the Nachbar. General Giora Eiland argued, "We are fighting Nazis." For all intents and purposes, Gaza, like Nazi Germany, was a state in which all its inhabitants were inextricably identified with the regime, a tightly knit unity, and therefore siege, disease, devastation, and total victory legitimate. This kind of dehumanizing mentality has extended to some military practice in which there is a kind of indifference to the victim's identity, age, or innocence. I don't need to go into this. I think you all have examples which we can go into later. Now, this critique of so-called naive liberalism does not take into sufficient account the danger and ever-increasing reality in which one loses one's own moral human face, which we have always claimed fundamentally distinguishes us from the other, the enemy. As in such situations, as Fintan O'Toole early noted, cruelty begets cruelty until there is nothing left but mutual destruction. Perhaps both metaphorically and literally, we shall all become, as both the Bible and Aldous Huxley warned, eyeless in Gaza. Let me turn to another mechanism, what I call, which is undermining the possibility of a liberal humanist sensibility. I call this empathic and disempathic narrativity. What are narratives? They are interested versions of what is deemed important to report, explain, emphasize, justify, or condemn. Apart from government sources, and often with them, the mass media, national radio, and television all largely shape respective versions of reality. The sheer amount of material and misinformation that is being hurled through the airwaves is kind of creating an epistemological catastrophe that is even creating lives in danger. What is certain, however, is that these are the most crucial instruments in determining the political economies of empathy or disempathy. Narratives that will respectively mobilize identification and sympathy, or contrarily, repugnance, demonization, or as importantly, simply indifference. Empathy may be a human characteristic, but what is most important about it is that it is politically structured, channeled, and directed, encouraged or blocked according to any number of cultural, political, and other factors. Empathic impulses often are identified with regimes of power. As Michael Ignatieff put it once, ethnicity and empathy are strongest always within one's own tribal, ethnic, national, and racial boundaries. In war, this is especially true. It has become clear to me that in this war, on the Israeli side, personalization and its mirror opposite, depersonalization, has been the most important force in the dynamics of empathic and disempathic creation. Now, I do not want to be misunderstood. The October 7th trauma undergone by Israeli society is agonizing, and the fate of the hostages is constantly on people's minds and in their souls. And that this is sincere, there is no doubt. It is a genuine concern, and it has galvanized a mass protest movement aimed at their urgent rescue. This is not only admirable, but caring for one's own is the most natural and desired response. Israeli media constantly and insistently relate these stories in the most intimate fashion. We are given the most detailed and, where possible, the most emotionally potent stories of each relevant individual, as well as their families, friends, and acquaintances. Some critics have argued that the endless repetition amounts to a kind of wallowing in these stories. Of course, these highly personalized stories of suffering naturally raise the empathic state to the highest level. And this is completely understandable. But it has its opposite twin. Whether or not explicitly desired or intentional, it is to entirely block and utterly depersonalize the experience of the other side. For almost the entirety of the war in Israel, Gaza has only appeared as an unidentifiable and constantly moving, displaced mass, devoid of personality, their suffering and pain invisible. I cannot remember a single individualized story of a Gaza Palestinian in our own mass media. Personalization heightens emotional identification, Depersonalization blunts the emotional and empathic impulse. Perhaps, too, there is the desire not to know. As one observer put it, we know that we don't want to know about the suffering and plight of the other side. Now, there are very important exceptions to this. The newspaper Haaretz, even though late in the war, left-wing organs, various internet sites, certain extraordinary non-conformist activists have given voice to this mutual pain. As Michael Svard, the human rights lawyer and grandson of the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, put it, I am in shock from October 7, and I am also in shock from what we're doing in Gaza. I didn't think we could do things like that. To erase, destroy, raise a place that is home to 2 million people, kill tens of thousands like that to shatter the health and education and the water infrastructure. In Gaza, he writes, we are burying the remnants of humanistic Judaism. Many outsiders have been shocked by this indifference to the plight of the Palestinians and the physical devastation of Gaza. Part of it is denial. There is really no hunger in Gaza, as one observer put it. Others say we know that we don't want to know. Or self-exemption through the nationalization that the killings and sufferings were justified and brought about by the enemy's own actions and Hamas's indifference to their own population, which they use as human shields. Of course, given terrible Israeli military fatalities, the commonly expressed sentiment, and it's completely understandable, is one always gives one's own pain and suffering primacy, that there is simply no room for opening one's heart to the suffering of others, especially when the other is seen as an enemy, thus again eliminating the distinction between Hamas and the civilian population. I'm sure you've heard of this man. I'm quoting him now. His name is Elon Musk. Elon Musk argues that the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. Just think about that. Because it is exploited by its enemies to undermine and destroy it. And I would add, actually, this quality of empathy is precisely what renders our own Western civilization valuable. At any rate, while my main concern is the question of the allocation of Israeli empathy on liberal and humanist sensibility, the test would also apply equally to Palestinian and generally Arab media. That is outside my purview today. I'm not going to deal with it, though it is often mentioned that virtually no Arab voices condemning the October 7 attack have been heard. Very often it's simply denied. With regard to the Western media, the political economy of empathy has been astonishing. Very soon after the October 7th attack had been heard, it was simply disregarded. No, excuse me. With regard to the Western media, the virtual universal condemnation of October 7th followed the defeat, suffering, and humiliation of Gaza and its people has been the almost singular focus. Most Israelis would not recognize the shocking scenes across the border, which overseas audiences are constantly exposed to and which are real enough. The main political economy of empathy in the West has been overwhelmingly disempathic to Israel. There may be a small way in which to salvage this impasse. While humanly we may understand the Israeli, Arab, and Western reluctance to fully empathize with the other side, perhaps what is needed is the creation of what Immanuel Kant and Hannah Arendt called an enlarged mentality, seeking to know and acknowledge what is happening on the other side. This, Arendt wrote, is not empathy. You're not supposed to feel as they feel, but to imagine through learning of their feelings, thinking how you would have felt. This is the condition for judgment. The enlarged mentality permits you to take into the account the perspective of others as well as their circumstances and your own. Now, I know by now, I hope that with this rather bleak picture, I've not depressed you too deeply or bored you. At the end of the talk, I will inject a few rays of brightness, but I've not yet broached the most obvious challenge to liberal democracy and humanist nationalism, and that is, of course, the threats that come from the inside. The danger of the end of liberal democracy, and with it a civil war that could threaten the survival of the state, is a matter of constant discussion and concern. Of course, this is a democracy qualified always by the fact of the disenfranchisement of Palestinians under military rule in the West Bank. But let's just for a moment concentrate on the inner existential state of things from the rise at the end of December 22 of Netanyahu's coalition government with its populist, annexationist, messianic, extreme right elements, through the attempted judicial revolution to the outbreak of war, and its seemingly endless continuation. It's just going on and on. Through all these developments, from the first day, I have been haunted by W.B. Yeats's great and uncannily relevant World War I poem, post-World War I. It's called The Second Coming. And above all of you probably know the famous lines, "Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world." That certainly reflects the shock and bewilderment of October 7th, when the massive failure of the political, military, and intelligence arms to predict their fate and effectively defend the border, both physically and psychically, was alarming. Here indeed was a nightmarish reality loosed upon the world. Yet when observing the great dangers to liberal and humanist nationalism from the inside, the anarchy, I don't think, is a completely unintentional or uncontrolled deus ex machina, which the poem talks about, but in some ways a kind of conscious, systematic upending of all the institutions, structures, norms, and guardrails of the tottering liberal order. In the name of the people, not only are the traditional liberal checks and balances between the executive, legislative, and judicial arms being overthrown, but the independent media, judges, the Attorney General, the heads of both the army and the security services, intellectuals, universities, and other independent agencies have all come under attack as anti-democratic forces undermining the will of the elected majority. The Prime Minister, who has been in power for virtually 17 years, and who himself appointed virtually all the officials he is now attacking, is constantly painting himself as a persecuted victim of an unidentified deep state. The Supreme Court, as one minister put it, is not acting for the good of the country, and has insisted that the distinguished ex-Chief Justice Aaron Barak should be put in jail, while other Knesset representatives say they will not respect the court's decisions. Moreover, the police are now under threat of being controlled as a kind of personal militia for a convicted felon, the racist Kahanist who is ironically the Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir. To this we should add that in a time of war, the government is seeking to ensure that the large ultra-Orthodox sector will be granted exemption from army service. It is not clear to me whether Netanyahu is enthralled to these extremist elements, or whether instead of loyalty to the independent norms and values of the state, personal loyalty to him is primary. And this is a prime minister currently on trial for fraud, breach of trust, and bribery. There's a later scandal called Qatargate, which I won't go into here. Now, I'm of course aware that these developments are part of a far wider tendency in which the broader Western liberal order is crumbling, and new political alignments, I need not tell you here, which the Israeli right is exploiting in this Trumpian age, are taking place. I think this is all well known to you, what is happening to the traditional liberal order. Unlike elsewhere, however, the Israeli anti-liberal turn is occurring at a time of war, and the most obvious connection is the very widely stated claim that Netanyahu is determined to prolong the war as long as possible to avoid elections and remain in power. However, the connections go deeper than that, and that in this context, actually not Mosse's study of nationalism, but his 1990 study of fallen soldiers is even more relevant. There he demonstrated how the brutalizing effects of World War I went beyond the battlefield and seriously impacted and even came to dominate internal civilian and political life. The Weimar Republic is the perfect example of the brutalization of the war and its importation into daily civilian political life. Domestic politics easily slides into a kind of battle between enemies, a Schmittian friend-foe mentality. War, almost by definition, it disinhibits, it liberates impulses that in everyday life are normally checked. Take just one example. Under the cover of war, very often with the active or passive participation of police and soldiers, the always violent hilltop settlers have become even more emboldened and harass, attack, kill the villagers, steal their sheep, and afterwards expel the villagers from their homes. This is a kind of accelerated cleansing proceeding apace in the Jordan Valley and the South Hebron Hills. This war too has provided cover, given the presence of Hamas militants there, for unprecedented air attacks on the West Bank, leaving the Jenin refugee camp, for instance, uninhabitable. In a so-called mobilized emergency, the war situation, it is easier to clamp down on opposition and critics of the government, who are now routinely labeled as traitorous leftists. The war under the present regime has brought about a noticeable coarsening of discourse, a certain brazen shamelessness, a casting off of previously accepted norms. For instance, the Justice Minister does not accept that the new president of the Supreme Court is legitimate, and various members of the ruling coalition have argued that they will not accept the court's verdict, whatever it may be. So all these major forces are at play. I'm coming to the end. Believe me, there is an end to this paper. You may not believe it, but there is. The major forces are intertwined and deeply connected. Despite the heavy protests and opposition, which I will discuss in a moment, under the cover of war and the insistence on patriotism and unity, the moves to annexation of the West Bank, to overhaul the judicial system, to incapacitate civil society, and perhaps ultimately to depopulate and then resettle Gaza. First, Gaza was going to become the new Riviera, and all the Palestinians would go to somewhere else. But today, or yesterday, Trump had a new idea. America will take over Gaza. Wonderfully suggestive idea. We are not there yet, but clearly we are approaching the point which was so vividly expressed by Antonio Gramsci in his prison notebooks. The old order is dead. The new is not yet born. In the interregnum, there arises a series of morbid symptoms. Thus far, the old order is not entirely dead. Freedom of the media and the press, and the freedom to demonstrate still exist. The judicial system, though under attack is holding up. So if the new is not yet born, there may be some glimmers of hope that the new will not be a morbid one of Israel turning into a totally isolated Sparta, wielding the sword, abandoned by its technological, business, medical, and academic elites, slowly declining into the mediocrity and fanaticism that partly surrounds it. What is this glimmer of hope? It is the admirable activity and the resilience of Israeli civil society. It is true, as Yeats put it, that the worst are full of passionate intensity. But it cannot be said of Israeli civil society that the best lack all conviction. Since the beginning of the war, apart from tending to its own coalition needs, the government has been virtually invisible, not running the country, the functioning of institutions, and tending to the huge needs of those who have been evacuated, and many who are physically, psychologically, and economically in need. You do not see the government. Critics argue the government is against the people. In any case, and operating under enormous strain, it is civil society that is admirably undertaking these tasks, while at the same time organizing massive daily protests, desperately urging for the release of the hostages and an end to the war, and also defending attacks upon the gatekeepers, such as the head of the security services and the Attorney General, and also upon the media, educational, judicial, and other institutions. And let me add parenthetically, because I've been very critical, so you understand my position. Many of these Israeli institutions are very much worth holding on to. In just over 70-some years, some of these achievements have been nothing short of magnificent. Israel has produced Nobel Prize winners, boasts fine museums, first-class research centers, a new world-class national library, high-quality and free public health systems, a booming musical and theater life, a vital economy of which anyone would be proud. Those who have been there know that life in Israel is characterized by an unusual existential intensity, nervous energy, creativity, and a kind of bustling, unresolved mix of passionate argument, joy, and anxiety. The fabric of daily existence, even under normal circumstances, is supercharged, intimate, precious, perhaps because somewhere deep in the collective psyche lurks the not entirely unwarranted fear that one's national and personal life is under threat. Perhaps that explains a certain dissonance in the demonstrators' camp, most of whom are liberals and humanists. For clearly, the war has even more unsettled one's own sense of security. Trust in the Palestinians and a future peaceful solution is at its lowest point ever. That is why the concentration of the protest movement on the Palestinians has been very, very quiet. While passionately opposing the attack upon Israel's democracy, liberal democracy, they are reluctant to include in the protests the question of Israel's continued military occupation of the West Bank, or even the broader question of some kind of peace with the Palestinians. Those who sideline these issues argue that they are too controversial, that in the struggle to rescue the hostages and defend liberal democracy and end the war, one needs a broad tent of consensus, and that the issues of occupation and human rights in general would split the movement. Ultimately, however, it seems that in the struggle for liberal democratic values and a humanist nationalism, the occupation whose corroding effects, especially now, have clearly seeped into and infected Israeli life itself, will have to be confronted and must be part of a wider arrangement. And although I said at the beginning, I will not discuss the geopolitics, I'm going to end now with a few thoughts about this. Given that the wider international post-Second World War liberal order seems to be crumbling, this is obviously hindering the remaining liberal forces in Israel too. At the same time, the war has rendered Israel strategically much stronger, with Hamas, Hezbollah, and even Iran considerably weakened, while Lebanon and Syria remain fractured and embroiled in deep crises and beholden to a certain Israeli military presence. Militarized power, however, does not bode well for a greatly strengthened texture of liberal humanism. But the ironies and dissonances are overwhelmingly. Internally, things are still too complex and fluid to predict an entirely bleak future. So then what about things to come? And historians hate predictions, and they almost always are wrong. So I'm going to lean again on Michael Schwab, who believes that in the struggle for Israel's national soul, some kind of Mossian liberal humanism will indeed prevail. True, he writes, there are nationalist, militarist, brutish, fascist and racist elements. But in parallel, there are also attributes of a democratic society that sanctifies pluralism and human rights and life. Both of these souls are ours. One is trying to kill the other. It may be that in the battle between these forces, political violence, even a civil war, may occur. But one should not forget that those in the most protests, the liberal forces, the technological, business, judicial, academia, media elites, and even large parts of the crucial security branches are the ones that not only are fighting back. I don't know if you know the case of Ronen Bar, who was the head of the security forces, who's openly challenged the government and the prime minister. These are people in whose hands the skills and the capital on which the entire economy relies. Moreover, there are clear signs that there is increasing resistance of soldiers to enlist in this unending war. And if, as I suggested, the liberal order seems to be evaporating, both nationally and internationally, there are equally signs, not only in Israel, but also in the United States, Canada, and many parts of Europe, of positive resistance, reaction to these anti-liberal forces. The present extreme anti-liberal regime and the relentless pressures it is facing may not be able to sustain itself in the election next year, in the hope that we'll be allowed to have an election and no civil war occurs. It is not impossible that this regime will have run out of money, steam, and support. Should the opposition forces win, there's also the chance of a willingness to find some political arrangement with the Palestinians in the context of a wider Saudi-led coalition, in a reshaped and more economically viable Middle East, where Israel is supposed to be a central player. I'm not sure what will prevail. The future always surprises us. Dystopia may occur, but actions do matter. There is also always contingency, as George Mosse reminded us. Contingency, the changing balance of the forces at play, a semblance of rationality, and Bloch's Prinzip der Hoffnung may still positively surprise us. Thank you. That's it. Okay.
Thank you so much for presenting this huge picture for us, and thank you most of all for your courageous openness. I think we do all agree here in this room that we want this appalling war to end by whatever argument, right? And I was glad to hear at the end of your talk that you think there is a future for people like George Mosse with their dreams of a liberal nationalism in Israel. On the other hand, one could have the idea from your analysis of the current situation that there is something like a renaissance of a muscular Judaism, but in a different sense, as Max Noro had it in mind, a military muscular Judaism, and that the current government in a very cynical way is benefiting from the attack of the Hamas at the expense of the liberal values and the democratic values that you were stressing, right?
Yeah. It's combined actually with it is a Judaism, and it is the Judaism of the Ben-Gvirs and the Smotriches, which is based upon a kind of primitive biblical literalism of power, of defeating Amalek, of saying the land belongs only to us, and it is going completely in defiance of the liberal democratic way in which even the Declaration of Independence is written. And it is the fusion of a messianic politics that is not only being encouraged by those forces, but which it seems the government is quite in sympathy with. And that is our danger. But it is also, as I'm saying, there are forces which are opposing this. Who will win, under what circumstances, how the wider context will come into play, I do not know. But the old order is dead, the new is not yet born, and we are in the middle. And I can't say more than that.
I was wondering to what extent the dilemma you exhibit is in some way analogous to the one you described with George Mosse, saying on the one hand, this humanitarian nationalism is idealistic and has never really faced the challenges of the situation of Israel. And on the other hand, you say we urgently need people who stick to it. Otherwise, there is no positive vision for the future.
Yeah, well, yes, we embody this. There are people who are watching what is happening and are deeply concerned. I don't think it's the good liberals who are going to win. Liberals really are good analysts. I don't know how activists, how good they are, but there are deeper forces at work here which may change the balance of power. And one of them is clearly the public opinion polls, which are clearly against continuing of the war, which are clearly not for a Netanyahu government. And they're not saying, however, it is also true that the sympathy for Palestinians is at its lowest possible moment. But at some point, I think they're going to have to recognize that this is an ongoing, unsustainable situation in which the West Bank is clearly colonized and oppressed peoples are going to rise up. And you're not going to solve the terrorist problem by increasing the activities. They may try to expel the population. Trump has suggested sending them all over the world, but that's not going to really happen. So, yes, it's as problematic as that. Yeah. And there are other people who you could invite who will give you a completely different picture. I'm saying that as a good liberal who can't even take my own side in an argument. Yeah.
I mean, you dedicated a good deal of your talk to the question of nationalism, and this was interesting for me because it seemed to me that somehow you wanted to replace Zionism, the topic of our lecture series, by nationalism as the true thing to think about. And I would like to ask you to what extent Israel, in your analysis, is just an example of challenges that every nation state has to face, or Israel is an exception, because
Yeah,
I think you were making the case for both sides.
I wasn't even aware that I was doing that. But this does bring me to an interesting point. And there is a kind of inherent structural tension here. On the one hand, Zionism is about normalizing. We want to be like everybody else. At the same time that they talk about normalization, or we talk about normalization, we also talk about our uniqueness, that we are a special case. And I'm not going to square the circle. I'm not going to say, oh, this is how you solve it. You live with tensions and structural tensions, which are not going to go away. On the one hand, we do claim we're a completely normal nation. We want to be treated like all the other nations in the world. Yet we also say we're a completely unique case. And probably both are true, even if they contradict each other. So we live with contradictions. There's a wonderful saying, roses are red, violets are blue, I'm schizophrenic and so am I. There you have it. So you live with the tension.
You only touched the question of binationalism in your talk, and I was wondering whether you put this to the naive side of humanitarian nationalism, or if you want to advocate for it and make a case for it and say this is the only solution where.
Well, again, you know, Dan Shiftan, who is an anti-liberal, who I quoted, he said solutions are for crossword puzzles, okay. Not for politics. In the book you mentioned, I've forgotten its name, Beyond the Border, the first chapter is on binationalism, with which I have clearly, that was my sense of a just way of dealing with it. If I have to look at the reality of the situation today, the lack of belief in the Palestinians on the Israeli side, and if I was a Gazan, and the whole of the Gaza is one Dresden or one Berlin in 1945, with a great deal of suffering, it's going to take enormous political pressure from above to get these two sides in some way to recognize each other. Whether that's going to take a long time, I don't know if binationalism is the solution. I don't know if federation is a solution. I do know one thing, that neither side has absolute right. And it is a question here of relative rights. And until that recognition comes, you just may have a state of Hobbesian war. It just may carry on. It's been going on for a long time, and hopefully the shock of this ongoing event will be so great that at some stage, maybe from the forces above, something will change. But I have no knowledge of this. I have no ability to predict.
We promised to open the floor for questions from the audience, and I'm sure you have many, so please feel invited to ask for the microphone. There is Theo who's...
And if you have no questions, that's absolutely acceptable. Yes.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, this works. So we could quite tell what you think about the current Israeli government, and I think we have that in common with most people in the room here. I'm wondering, as a German, of course, how you see the role of Germany and the German government and the German kind of extra democratic Staatsräson, Raison d'État that we're dealing with, and this unconditional support regardless of the government and so on. So I'm wondering if you have an opinion on that, if you can contextualize how you perceive this and how this is perceived.
Precisely a question I did not want to address. It's conspicuously absent from my talk. And as I said, I have enough problems with my own, I called it, unsettled Israeli experience. And it would be, I think, distasteful for me to get into the question of what I think of, German government positions. Clearly, not every critique of Israel is anti-Semitic. That's clear to me. But I do realize the great sensitivity of these questions to a German audience. And so I'm going to be a coward, as liberals usually are, and not answer your question. Although I think you could probably guess where I stand.
Well, hopefully. Thank you very much for a very impressive lecture. Towards the end of your lecture, you referred to the military occupation of the West Bank and its role in, if I understood it correctly, the endangering of Israeli democracy. And I've heard these voices from Israeli colleagues many years before the events of October 7. Therefore, I also wondered when you quoted George Mosse in 1986, almost 20 years after the beginning of the occupation, what he thought about this question, in how much this influenced the further development or the chances for humanistic nationalism. And if I may add a second question, in how far changes in the Israeli society, which changed a lot over the last decades by immigration and other factors, influenced the current situation, the current political situation, because these might be factors which are long-lasting and cannot be changed so easily. It's not only ideology.
Yeah, no. I mean, let me take your second comment first. There are those who believe that demography is destiny. And the demographic change in Israeli society is very clear. That is to say, what were called the Mizrahim, people who came from Arab and African countries, now represent something close to, if not actually the majority. And most of them have been until now clear supporters of the Netanyahu and right-wing forces. And there are clear exceptions to this. I don't want to make a huge generalization, but you may be right. This is one of the forces. However, the shock to the Israeli psyche has been so great, and that many of the hostages, including hostages who are now there, are from what are called Mizrahi families. And these are people who are clearly not going to vote for Bibi Netanyahu. They may vote for Lieberman, who's on the right, or Bennett, who's on the right, who may win the election. So you do have right-wing forces that are anti-Bibiist. And so I'm not entirely pessimistic and think, well, because the demographic are what is called Ashkenazim as against Mizrahim is eternal, things develop, things fluid. And you must realize that many heads of the army, the air force, and others are people who come from Arab countries. So demography doesn't have to be destiny. Things change, things are developing. It seems to me that the disillusionment is so great, and as the war continues, becomes greater, that I wouldn't say that this is going to eternally determine Israel's future. Now, I left out a few things about Mosse. He has a very early, I actually brought it with me, but I didn't have time to talk about it. At one point, Mosse argues, because nationalism or Zionism, and I'll talk about the difference between them in a moment, is so complicated. I mean, the truth is that nationalism homogenizes, or it has a tendency to homogenize. And the problem of minorities is there. And in one article in the Madison Capital Times, which is read by about 8 people, he comes out clearly with an argument for federation. So, but he doesn't do that later on. He comes out early for federation, and then in 1986 he says what he says, and I quoted that. So the question of Mosse, when he was in Israel, he did drive to the West Bank. We often used to go down to Jericho in the earlier days, and he kind of used to smoke this, what's it called? The nargila, which kind of half drugs you. I was driving, so I didn't take it. So I can't remember a radical critique of the West Bank politics from Mosse. I just can't remember that. Maybe he didn't think it was his place. But he did come out at certain moments in the idea of federation. And the other, I talked about his emotional psyche, in which he was deeply attracted to. And let me tell you, so am I. The feeling of being, as a Jew, in some kind of normative majority is a liberating feeling. And the fact that I can make that critique is a function of that liberating element. I couldn't do that if I was here, but I can do that because I'm there. So I think that's important, and that Mosse would recognize that.
I want to thank you, but I also want to challenge you a little. You spoke of Israel after 7 October. You also, sorry, spoke about the occupation. But there's like one thing that usually I don't hear Israelis talk about, and it's the fact that we keep on relating to Israel as a democracy. Well, it's not really a democracy. It is a democracy if you're Jewish, but I'm not sure if you're not Jewish, you'd accept, the definition of Israel as a democracy. And maybe, as liberals, that is the problem with us being okay with the lie that Israel is not really a democracy, but a pseudo-democracy, which, is maybe on tracks to becoming a democracy, but never was. And maybe this and the lack of civic equality in Israel is part of the problem, and it's there since the establishment of Israel. So maybe it is something that we all have to.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't want to go into this because it's complicated as hell, like life. Let's make a distinction between ethnic and civil nationalism. The civic nationalisms are the United States, at least until Trump came into power, the United States, Canada, Australia. Those are all civic nationalisms which are completely inclusive, which all exist precisely because they destroyed the indigenous populations to which they came. You can have a civic nationalism if there is a new beginning and the indigenous parties are out of the way. So what is a real democracy and what is a pseudo-democracy? It depends on your perspective, because all three of those democracies are dependent upon initial genocides. I didn't go into the question of genocides. Let's leave that aside for a moment. That's number one. There is, without doubt, 85% of all nationalisms, except for the civic nationalisms of Australia, Canada, and the United States, are to some degree folkish or ethnic. If you get Ireland or Lithuania or wherever you are, there is an ethnic base. But first of all, you're dead right. You cannot claim to have a democratic society if millions of people are entirely disenfranchised, which is true for the West Bank. In other words, what is the most simple definition of democracy is consent by the governed. You're talking about inside it. Now, there is an issue here. And the issue was until 1966, the Arab minority And by the way, they became a minority when initially they were a majority. But what can I say? The history of nationalism and the history of empires and the history of humanity. You virtually can't find one state that was founded peacefully. That are almost all founded by wars and conflict and conquest and violence. Until 1966, there was military rule over the Arab minority. That went away. There is no doubt that the Arab minority does not have, either socially or actually, the same equality or powers that the Jewish majority have. And that's inherent in the idea of a Jewish state, or, as the right-wing Zionist says, it's also true for the surrounding Arab countries, which define themselves as Arab societies. But let me just tell you one thing. There's a difference between abstract definitions and lived experience. For a reason that's completely irrelevant here, I spent 5 months in an Israeli hospital in treatment. And from the lowest workers to the highest administrators and the doctors, between the Arabs and the Jews in the hospital during war, there wasn't one iota of hostility. That does not mean that the society is more democratic. It does mean that in the fabric of everyday existence, of comity between peoples, there is some hope. I do not deny for 1 second that this is an imperfect democracy. But show me a perfect one, and I'll be happy to accept that. Yeah, please.
I'm not talking about a perfect democracy. I'm just talking about equal rights, and this is something that is neglected. And I agree that in Israel there's a lot of hope, and there are a lot of activists that are working to coexist within this region. But the majority and the daily life in Israel is lacking equality, and it's just overlapped. Nobody's talking, well, most of the people do not talk about it, and it is crucial when we talk about ethnicity and when we talk about how we define ourselves, okay? We also have to understand that maybe kind of like Mendelssohn, that you can have your own entity of who you are and who you believe you are, but you are also part of a greater society, and equality is part of it. When we talk about Israel, we always lack the equality part, and we talk about all the rest. But I believe, and it's not for the sake of argument, that without talking about it, there will be no solution.
Well, I don't disagree. In fact, during the talk, there were various moments when I talked exactly about that. However, my pessimism lies that in the midst of this war, the antithesis of what we expect is happening. And the hope is that through these convulsions, and this is a convulsion that is occurring, it's an earthquake, something else will emerge in which there will be greater equality. I think that should be clear from what I was saying. But as Ernst Bloch, who was a hell of a nice guy, but he at times, he did exaggerate. The Prinzip der Hoffnung is weakened by war. And you have to kind of grasp what you can in the hope. But I do not disagree with what you're saying. Yeah.
Since I see that it's almost 9 o'clock in the evening, and I'm afraid to, end with a hot farewell after a very warm welcome, I would like to ask if there are other questions in the room, urgent things to be discussed with Stephen Aschheim. Take advantage of the situation.
I don't see a hand. He's sighing. Then thank you very much for your interest. Thank you, Stephen, for a fantastic opening of our lecture series.
Okay.
I'd like to invite you to next Friday's lesson. I switch to German. Es geht weiter am nächsten Freitag. Bitte denken Sie noch einmal daran, dass wir aus unserem Donnerstag-Rhythmus ausbrechen, davon abweichen. Mark David Baer wird dann unser Gast sein und über die Children of Abraham sprechen, mit einem Schwerpunkt auf den muslimisch-jüdischen Beziehungen, die jetzt schon am Ende des Vortrags gestanden haben. Wir freuen uns, wenn Sie auch dann wieder mit Interesse dabei sind. Haben Sie jetzt erst einmal einen schönen Abend. Dankeschön.